So I recently had a client with whom I did a paid consultation call who wanted to figure out whether he should set up a US LLC or a Hong Kong LLC as his main operating company. And this is a question that many expat entrepreneurs have. After all, the US LLC and the Hong Kong company both offer a lot of very similar benefits. That is 0% tax in the country of registration, good payment processing options, great banking options, and generally a very easy and affordable company structure to set up in a major financial hub. So I thought I'd make this video to sort of compare the US LLC as well as the Hong Kong LLC based on the specific situation that we had in this call, because I think it can teach us a lot that you can learn and apply into your situation as to which one of these structure, or in general, what structure should you set. And in case you want to set up either the US LLC or the Hong Kong company or a UAE company or whatever structure, there's going to be links to my partnered services in the description down below. So to give a background of the situation that we're going to talk about here, this is a guy from Australia where he had recently relocated to Dubai. So he's now living in Dubai, and he had set up a company in Dubai for the purpose of getting a residence visa for him in the UAE. So the first piece of the structure, there is a UAE company, and he still has the Australian company in order to process payments from these Australian clients. And this is the company that he used to run in Australia. So we have an Australian company here, which we need to think about what to do. And then he had set up already actually a Hong Kong company. His idea was that he wants to have a tax neutral company structure as his main holding company, and ideally move those Australian clients into this Hong Kong company, because Hong Kong companies have the benefits of having 0% tax in Hong Kong if the company has no operations in Hong Kong. And his main problem was that should he set up a US LLC for payment processing, because he had heard from my videos that US LLCs are often very good for payment processing. And then should he have a US LLC and Hong Kong company, or should he have one or the other? What should he do with the UAE company, the Australian company? Is basically figuring out what's the best structure in this particular situation. So the thing about the key considerations here, the first of them is going to be billing, and this is going to be the most important point here. Really, when you're choosing a company structure, it's really not about taxes. Like a lot of people think like, oh, which structure should I set up for optimal taxes? Taxes mostly depend on where the real management and control and the real operations of the company are. They don't really depend on where the company is registered. It's just that some structures like the US LLC and the Hong Kong company have the benefit that they're not also taxed in the company of registration. So it matters in that sense. So really the key consideration on whether he should use the US LLC or the Hong Kong company was going to be billing, meaning specifically payment processing and specifically the fees associated with it. And this is where they differ quite a bit. So if we just look at Stripe, for example, via US LLC versus the Hong Kong company, the US LLC is going to have much more favorable rates, especially if we're talking about US customers. And the key detail here is that he was going to be expanding his business to the US very soon. And if you look at the fees, Stripe for US companies charges 2.9% on all transactions, which in of itself is quite high, but whatever, plus 1.5% for international charges, plus 1% for currency conversion. So if you charge in some other currency than the US dollar, there's going to be an extra 1%, but that is not going to be the case here. Whereas with a Hong Kong company, the fee is going to be 3.4% for local cards, but none of his customers are going to be local. So he's also going to have 0.5% for international customers, plus 2% for currency conversion. So at the highest, he could potentially have fees of 5.9% when you add all of that together. Now, if you have a Hong Kong company, but you charge in US dollars, there is a way for you to set up your Hong Kong Stripe in such a way that the settlement currency is actually the US dollar. So you can actually avoid this currency conversion fee if you are charging in US dollars instead of Hong Kong dollars. However, even then, if you want to withdraw these US dollars from your Hong Kong Stripe, you need to first of all have a US dollar account with a Hong Kong bank account. Shouldn't be too difficult to get that one, but there is also going to be a 1% fee to withdraw these US dollars, which you would not have for Hong Kong dollars. So really his fee when charging US customers via the Hong Kong company would be 4.9% versus 2.9% for the US company. So clearly, if there is even a moderate amount of billing happening, it is much more advantageous to simply form the US LLC and do all the US billing and probably also all the Australian billing via the US LLC, because the extra fees that you would pay when doing it with a Hong Kong company would be so much higher than it more than pays for the cost of running the LLC, which is, by the way, very light. We now do this in-house at GenZone, where the setup cost is only $1,000 and it is only $300 to renew it every year, although I think we're gonna increase that price at some point, but right now that's where it is. Now the second consideration was going to be hiring, because he was going to be doing some hiring in the US and around the world as well. And this is where there might be some tax complications. If you have a US LLC with regular contractors from the US, this can create what is called effectively connected income in the US, meaning that the portion of the revenue or the profit that is generated by the physical operations in the US could be taxable in US. Now, this is always case by case. I directed him to a US tax professional, which we can also connect you to if you use our services with the US LLC, to essentially determine exactly like how much could the US tax liabilities be and everything like that. But really here again, whether that tax liability arises doesn't really depend on what structure you use to hire those contractors, whether it's a US structure or a Hong Kong company directly. Really what matters is, again, the facts on the ground, like how much work is there actually being done. Now, in terms of taxes really are going to depend more on where is the real management and control, where are the real operations than when the company is registered. He had his Australian company and it was like, okay, is this going to create Australian tax liability if he keeps that, if he wants to like keep the billing via the Australian company, which by the way, he absolutely can do. Now, I'm not sure of the exact rules in Australia, but again, most likely this is going to depend a lot more on is there actual physical work being done in Australia rather than is there an Australian entity or something like that doing billing or something like that. The one thing that he did want, as we discussed, which is why he couldn't use the UAE company, he wanted a tax neutral setup. He wanted something where if he decides to leave the UAE in the future, he can do that without creating any other tax complications and without essentially being tied to the UAE, which he would be if he had the UAE company, which is why Hong Kong company as the potential holding company to the US LLC or the US LLC as his only company could make more sense. Okay, so at this point, it was clear that he should set up the US LLC because he was doing a lot of selling to the US, and just from the fee perspective, it makes a lot of sense. The second question was then, does it make sense to keep the Hong Kong company at all, or can he just keep the US LLC? So in a lot of cases, you have a very simple operation. You just have a single member or even two members, and you don't expect to get like funding or anything like that. You don't want to scale the company to a sale or something like that. It could just work that you only have the US LLC. It's a very, very light structure, very easy to run. For most people, that's probably what would make more sense. However, in his case, he was going to have multiple directors coming into the company. He was gonna be giving stock to them. He was saying that he wants to scale the company and eventually sell it. For all those things, while you could, US LLC is not a corporation in the same way that a lot of different company structures, and it's not really designed for that. A lot of the time, if you speak to, for example, startup people in the US, they will never recommend you to use a LLC if you want to have a startup where you take, for example, venture capital funding, or you want to sell it or something like that. Because essentially, if you have an investor, they cannot really invest into an LLC because it's just much more complicated. But it's not a corporation where you cannot create stock and things like that. So for anything like that, a Hong Kong company is more of like a real company, a real corporation. It makes sense to have a structure like that. We can easily issue stock and it's going to be easier to sell it. And also with the Hong Kong company, because there's a requirement that you need to do an annual audit every single year with the Hong Kong company, that is going to create a lot more documentation, like real proof, which is going to be very beneficial to show when eventually you want to sell it. Whereas with the US LLC, when you don't even need to do accounting in the US and things like that, it's just going to be a bit more difficult for a situation like that. The other thing to consider for a lot of people is going to be obviously maintenance. So often with this decision, you need to kind of trade off between being optimal versus being simple. In his case, at his level and his volume, it wasn't a big deal to like have two different companies doing like compliance for two different companies or something like that. But for a lot of people, if you have like a lighter operation, it might even make sense in some cases to have a slightly less optimal structure with maybe you have just a Hong Kong company with a higher fees if you don't want the hassle of having to deal with two companies at the same time. So that's going to be kind of a subjective decision for many people. Either way, both of these are very easy structures to run. The US LLC is going to be a bit lighter. Hong Kong company is going to have a bit more requirements, but in return, you're going to get your audited financials every single year. You have a bit more of a legit structure with great documentation and everything like that, which is going to be very beneficial for like bigger operations and things like that. So in general, both these are great options. In his case, essentially, it made sense to have both of them. But let's say you only want to choose one. In which cases do you want to use a Hong Kong company / like what are the benefits of a Hong Kong company? Well, we kind of already talked about this. It's more of like a legit real business where you're going to have your audited financials, especially if you aim to have a much bigger operation, especially if you think you're going to have investors or something like that. The other benefit is going to be that you're probably going to have more banking options. Now, it has become more difficult to have a Hong Kong business bank account as a non-Hong Kong resident, but you have more options there than the US LLC. And generally, I would say the business environment in Hong Kong is going more in the right direction. It's becoming easier for foreigners, whereas in the US, it's becoming less easy for foreigners. Not substantially yet, but the general trend is that there's a bit more requirements. Like it used to be the case that you don't have to give any information about the founder or anything like that. Now they have this beneficial owner report that's kind of like on the grader, like, do you need to do it or not? There's a bit more requirements, and I would say that it's more likely that the US are going to end this tax exemption on non-resident founders than that Hong Kong would do that, because whether you like it or not, the US is a declining empire, whereas Hong Kong, well, I guess China, but by extension Hong Kong, are a rising empire. So I have a bit more confidence on the business regulations and the direction of Hong Kong than the US. So there's like something to think about there. The main determinant between these two structures really, however, comes down to where are your customers? What are you billing? If you have customers in the US, you should almost certainly have at least the US LLC, maybe alongside a different structure, or not if you don't need that. However, if you don't sell to the US, then the Hong Kong company can work well also just for billing. And especially if you sell to China, then obviously Hong Kong company is going to work much better. They have really good integrations with like WeChat Pay and Alipay and all the like Chinese payment processing. But that's probably not going to be most people watching this channel, because this is an English language channel. There's mostly Westerners probably watching this. So I would say for more cases, US LLC is probably going to make more sense, just because more people are going to have like lighter, smaller operations. Like you have like a simple e-commerce business or a consulting business or like a SaaS or something like that. A US LLC is going to be easier, lower fees, lower maintenance, everything. But if you have a bigger operation, if for whatever reason you don't want to have any connection with the US or something like that, the Hong Kong company is going to be a great option. And again, either way, you can't really go wrong with either of these. So this was kind of a different video than what I usually make. I hope this was interesting. Again, like a real world case study, or like the kind of things you need to think about when thinking about where to form your company. And again, if you want to set up either of these structures, I'm going to leave links down below to GenZone, where we now do US LLC setup in-house. You get your LLC set up in 48 hours. All the filings, everything you need, specifically targeted for non-US resident LLC founders. And for Hong Kong, I will link to my partners at Awesome. And with that said, I will see you in the next video.